Hi, I'm Amy Lusher, and I'm a research scientist at the Norwegian Institute for Water Research in Oslo. I have been working in the field of plastic and microplastic pollution for several years now, and my interest is mostly driven by wanting to understand the consequences that plastic litter has on the environment and wildlife, particularly in our oceans and along our coastlines. I would like to talk to you briefly about how litter and plastic pollution can affect wildlife. This includes big items of litter that you can easily see, but also microplastics, which are smaller than a grain of rice and harder to identify in the environment. Let's start with the big stuff, macro litter and macroplastics. These can affect wildlife in two main ways. Firstly, large items present a hazard in the form of entanglement. Animals might become trapped in littered items, including derelict fishing gear, ropes, plastic bags, even frisbees. The consequences of this interaction may lead to cuts and lesions, restriction in movement, compromised feeding, and ultimately lead to the death or drowning of individuals. If we consider the oceans, which is where much of the early research on plastic pollution originated, images of whales and dolphins, seabirds and seals and turtles entangled in fishing gear or other plastic items have become commonplace. Similar images have emerged on land, with animals becoming trapped in littered items. Animals may also ingest plastics, whether intentionally or unintentionally. For example, a turtle eating a plastic bag because it looks like a jellyfish, an albatross feeding its chicks plastics instead of fish, or a baleen whale ingesting plastics along with plankton whilst it filter feeds large volumes of seawater. Once these items have entered the digestive tracts of animals, large items of litter and plastics may not easily come out the other end, and instead remain in their stomachs and their digestive tracts. This can impede feeding, presenting a false sense of fullness, and may lead to malnutrition. In extreme cases, this can also lead to death. Marine mammals that have been stranded on coastline and have been necropsied have revealed some levels of plastics in their stomachs and digestive tracts, and in some instances, plastic bags and other items have become compacted, leading to malnutrition. In most cases, the plastics may not be the cause of death, but they are a contributing factor. It's not just the ocean where animals can be seen entangled or ingested with plastic. We also see similar images of animals from the Arctic and even the desert environments interacting with plastics in a way that could compromise their well-being. On Svalbard, in the Arctic Circle, reindeer have been observed with ropes and other fishing gear entangled on their antlers. And in the desert, the remains of camels have been found to contain calcified masses of plastic bags and ropes. I think the images of camels in the desert have been most shocking, as this is an obvious mortality related to plastic ingestion. These plastics are caught up in their complex digestive system and form a calcified mass, which eventually leads to malnutrition and death, leaving skeletons and plastic gastroliths composed of a variety of different plastic material as a clear reminder of what can happen when plastics are not removed from our environment. The large item of plastics are easy to see and can have obvious impacts and consequences to our environment and to our wildlife. But there are some other not so obvious impacts, and these are related to microplastics. There have been hundreds of studies investigating the presence of small plastics or microplastics inside animals collected from the marine environment and on land. And when these animals are ingesting plastic, it is not likely that they will be in a sufficient quantity to lead to mortality, but there could be other consequences for the individuals. We are still trying to disentangle the consequences related to microplastic ingestion, determining the differences between observations in the wild and exposures carried out under laboratory conditions. There are discontinuities between animals exposed to microplastics under laboratory conditions, where studies can focus on a particular plastic type and their impacts, compared to those investigations in the wild where animals are exposed to a heterogeneous mix of plastic sizes, shapes, polymers, and concentrations, as well as the associated chemicals. In most instances, animals in the wild are perfectly healthy when they are sampled, So an impact of microplastics can only really be noted as the presence of plastics in their digestive tracts or other tissues. It is possible, and several studies have shown, that microplastics can also be ingested and released back into the environment in the form of feces. We know that some of the consequences of plastic ingestion can lead to mortality, and this is mostly an impact on an individual scale. We also need to consider the effects across the whole spectrum of biological organisation, from the cellular level to the population level. Impacts on microplastics can occur in relation to reproduction, growth, and behaviour, and we need to assess the whole manner of these consequences, as well as focusing across the spectrum to allow us to truly understand what is happening when wildlife are interacting with plastics as well as microplastics. Even more imperative are investigations into the smaller nanoplastics. Now, these are plastics which are even smaller than microplastics, and they have the potential to move inside cells and impede cellular functions. What is clear from research into litter and plastics is that the effects on wildlife depends on the size of plastics they interact with, as well as any chemical additives they are associated with. Large items and their consequences may be obvious, but in the case of small plastics, microplastics and nanoplastics, their consequences are much harder to understand.